Hello, I'm Alicia Parr, the CEO and founder of Perform Mentor, and I'm here with Olalah Njenga, who is the CEO of Yellowwood Group, right here on our first episode of Leader to Leader Talks. Welcome, Olalah.
Thanks for having me, Alicia.
Well, first of all, we're going to talk about the evolving attitudes of the workforce because a lot's going on out there and things are changing. And in fact, I would argue that things have been changing a very long time in the workforce. I mean, would you, share that observation?
Absolutely. I think when I talk about workforce issues, I always talk about them as pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, and how the pandemic really amplified a lot of the changing attitudes about work. And then they really became front and center as employers were fighting for talent. We had a talent war. Some would argue we're still in a talent war. And then there's what motivates and inspires employees and what no longer works. And so there's been a huge spectrum of likes and dislikes and preferences and expectations that's been happening across the workforce. So it's exciting and it's also exhausting if you're an employer and employee to some regard.
Yeah. It's like you're trying to meet so many different needs, even like old perspectives and new perspectives, and like how in the heck do you
Yeah.
even do that? And then you've got the technology that's changing, that's
Mhm.
enabling so much more. But the
Yeah.
pandemic, that's such a good point. I
Right.
don't know about you, but I've been working in organizations that I've had the freedom to work hybrid, have a lot of flexibility. And then when
Right.
the pandemic came, while some organizations were already walking that path, a lot
Right.
of them found themselves challenged with
Right.
the new situation. What did you
Right.
see?
Yeah. So, like you, I've had the good fortune of having worked big business before I ran a company, and so I only ever knew hybrid, and so for me, it wasn't much of a shift. And to my delight and shock, actually, my team was real gung ho about like, hey, can we make this a permanent situation? And so they were able to share with me some of the things that were happening in the background of their life and how being permanently remote would really actually boost their productivity if they could work asynchronously. And I think that that's the biggest challenge for larger businesses is how do you get the work done? How do you make sure that the work is getting done when your team wants to work asynchronously? Because in office time allows for that person to person dialogue, do everything in real time. But the truth of the matter is, there's probably at least half of the average employee's workload, unless they physically need to be like on a shop floor, things like that, that can be done at any time of day. So it really comes down to, well, what matters most, that you can put eyes on your people or that your people are getting the work done? And that's a culture conversation, right? It's a values conversation. And it can be a little prickly, I think, for some leaders to kind of take that on and figure out, well, what do we do with this when expectations are changing?
Yeah, I find that the conflict is like, it's not even so much in the words being said, it's that there's assumptions beneath
Mm,
that about what makes for a high performing team. And I don't
right.
think there is a lot of alignment sometimes within the same business or
Yeah.
even within the same executive team at a particular business.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny that term high performance because there's different understandings about what performing actually means. And I think that that's funny because I always switch it out for the word output, right? Because you can be high performing at the thing that is not necessarily valuable to your team, your department, your company. And there's some of that that's happening, right? Because people are splitting their desires. And so they've got side hustles and other places where their heart and their passion want to go. So they're performing, but when it comes to high performing, they may not be working on those projects that are high profile or high profit margin or high productivity. And so I always look at output and I share that, with my clients. Like, what is the output expectation that you have as a leader? What's the output expectation as a manager? And what can get tricky is when the leader and the manager are one and the same person at a smaller company. Like my company is a smaller company and wearing those two hats. So having that list of expectations around what performing means and different levels of the company and across different departments is the conversation, I think, gets lost under niceties. And what I mean by that is like nobody wants to ruffle anybody's feathers or makes a person feel like they're not performing. But if you don't know what the expectation is, then you can't meet it. And if you don't express it as a leader, how can you expect your team to have output that makes sense for what you value as the leader? So it's quite a conundrum, I think. It's got a lot of leaders on the run.
Well, I'm thinking about, that phrase, right people, right seats, and we think about, we want to get the peoples, who have particular talents and abilities and in the right roles. And what I thought about is a slightly expanded meaning on right seats, is the right seat for this particular task or responsibility.
Okay.
Around other people physically? Does it need to be happening synchronously, or can we do it asynchronously? Or is this something that can be done? I was actually just talking to a couple of other CEOs yesterday, and that's what we were talking about. It's like there's a lot of assumptions that I think you're pointing at, is that the best way to ensure that people are interacting and innovating together is to be able to see them do it. And sometimes it's probably true, but I think we're finding that not always.
Not always, as a lot of things are in business and in life, not always. I do think that the one linchpin, if there's a kind of a shooting star in this, is that there's an appetite for employees to have more professional development, specifically around stepping up their leadership acumen. And there is an appetite on the employer side for employees to be a little more polished, to take on more responsibilities, to expand their body of knowledge, and to incorporate conscious technology, is what I refer to it as when I work with my clients. Like, what are those components of technology, intelligence, automation, all of those component parts that allow their employees to work smarter and faster and less? Because that is one of those sticky things where, well, why would you want an employee to work less? Well, here's what we know, right? Even if a person is scheduled to work a 40-hour week, which is its own problem in and of itself, and I don't even want to go into that one. You're really, as an employer, only really getting somewhere between 30 and 32 hours of real output. And so if you create an environment where technology and intelligence and automation support the employee and they can free up cognitive power, then you give them what I call dream space. What you really want your employees to be able to do is have enough brain power left in them on any given day to come up with $1 million idea that your company can knock out the park. So if you put them in a position where they're working all night and it's just the hum, and the technology is only there so they can do more instead of dream more, then you're really not getting the best out of them, and they're not bringing their best self to the workplace. They're just bringing their, what I like to call, their leftover energy, because they're constantly using that high level organic energy. And so what you end up getting is the leftover energy, or what I call the synthetic energy. It's like time to make the donuts, if you remember that commercial.
That reframe is really important, that reframe between dream space and, I think, there's another term that many of us are familiar with, operational slack. That sounds a little drier.
I'm always here for the reframe, Alicia. Like, I'm always like, how can we say this in a positive declarative?
Well, how can we say it in a way that helps us look at it differently? And, one of the things that you're looking at, or we're looking at when we think about, these things differently, is, it's not just people and time, it's their energy.
Absolutely.
You can certainly, I guess, dictate how people spend their time, but you can't dictate how they spend their energy. So that's kind of
and the quality of that energy, right? I can be doing the work, but if my heart is not in it, my head is not in it, then I'm getting it done. I'm checking the box. Do we really want to become a labor force of box checkers, right? Because that's
people.
That's it. That's a whole nother segment. Commitment versus compliant is an argument that I have in a workshop that I do called Strategy is a Verb. And it's rather enlightening, because I think a lot of leaders don't recognize that there are people who would prefer negative reinforcement versus positive reinforcement. That's that, carrot and the stick.
Yeah.
I like to think that our current workforce, our modern workforce right now, is much more carrot driven. But if you're a stick driven manager or leader,
Yeah.
then you kind of really only know that one trick pony. And there's some of that values disconnect that deflates people and de-energizes people and demotivates people. And so they're performing, but they're not high performing. And you as a leader don't even recognize that there's a difference. And that's not just scary, but that's also kind of sad, because how you treat people matters, whether it's life or the workplace,
Yeah, I mean, I think with the leaders, I think they're we're leaders too. We intend well, but sometimes, I don't know if you do this, but we're all a little different, and that's part of the beauty of us being a little different.
Right.
But sometimes when we're leading someone else, we forget that they're different, and maybe they aren't motivated the same way that we are.
Yes.
Maybe not the same things. So when we want to go and motivate somebody, we might try to motivate them the way that we want, like the carrot stick thing that you just described.
Right.
I hate to do that.
Yeah.
So
That's why I always recommend, when I work with leaders, like I ask them, like, when's the last time you did a motivation assessment? And sometimes they give me the scrunchy face, like, oh, what? There are so many tools out there. There's free tools. I like motivation assessments because it gives you a screenshot of what are the top 3 things that really make sense to that person. I do it and I share it with my team, right? So I've shared with them, like, here's my top 3. What's your number 1? We have huddles and talk about, like, hey, how were you able to play in your number 1 motivator this week? Well, mine, full disclosure, is autonomy, which is horrible as a leader because it means that I really want to be working by myself. I don't know. I blame it on being an only child. But anyway, I digress. And so what I've had to negotiate, with my team is I need alone time so that I can re-energize and regenerate so that I can be my best self. So I have little chunks of the day where I'm just unavailable. And I am better when I have that piece of autonomy to kind of think about the future. Where's the company going? How would you like to be developed? How would you like to be part of that? And so I think having those conversations with your team, no matter what level of direct report you have, around, well, what really motivates you? And surprise, as the longer a person stays with you, the more likely it is that those motivators will shift over time as they've been exposed to different things. So that's always an interesting conversation
the
around, well,
culture,
what motivates you? Yeah.
the culture that people work in really shapes things, and then so do our the broader culture, in terms of the generational effects, and
Yes.
and as sort of a maybe a wrap-up thought that we can expand on in a later session is that changing work attitudes, like I mentioned, it's been going on for a long time. If you go back all the way to when the baby boomers were, there's still a lot of them. If you think about what's important to them, loyalty and respect. Then you got the Generation Xers, which is us, we're autonomy, as you mentioned. I would say diligence, kind of, and then Gen Y, the millennials, they're like, hey guys, we want to be working in our strengths and our point of genius. We want to have a purpose behind our work. And then you got the Z's that are like, I need flexibility and I want a lot of freedom. And when I look at all that, and like, they're all right. They're all correct.
Right.
So
there can be more than one truth.
yeah. And I would say that what's changing in the workplace is that we're trying to change things so that all of these different generations are getting the pieces that most want and need, because what one generation wants the most, others also value.
Absolutely. And it also, and dovetailing that into a final point that I'll make here is, it also depends on where you are in your life, right? And so if you're juggling work, family, harmony, regardless of the generation that you're in, it's a different kind of strain than, let's say, if you're a caregiver, right? And so, or if you have a strong preference to working with technology and your manager has a strong preference not to. So some of it's a lifestyle issue, it's a generational issue, it's a preferential issue. And so when you combine all these things together, it can make it harder to lead when you have a multi-generational workforce. And it can make that harder to lead even more complicated if you now have to think about, do we want FaceTime together? Does it make sense for people to be asynchronous? What does flexible mean to one person versus someone else? And so it's an ongoing conversation. And I think the point that should be pressed is, if you keep that conversation warm, keep it on simmer constantly, revisit that conversation, whether it's every quarter or twice a year, so that you don't miss the boat, so that people don't get kind of dropped in the cracks of the conversation and those voices and perspectives are not heard. And you have to be, as an employee, your own advocate. You have to speak up and have those conversations with your leadership team to say, you know what, this is what worked for me and I want to stay. Like, a lot of times we think it's an either or, right? It's like, either I get to work, part-time and remote, or I'm out the door. It can come across that way. But sometimes it's just that employees don't necessarily know how to package what they want and need and prefer in a way. And so it just kind of comes out as an ultimatum. Do you know what I mean? And so sometimes leadership says things like, well, this is what the company needs. And sometimes that feels like a get on board or get out the door. And so got to keep that conversation warm, keep that door open, because we're all people, just trying to be better humans and trying to figure out what makes sense in the workplace. So,
So in sum, a whole crap ton of stuff is changing. We have a whole lot of different people trying to work together. So there is no easy button, but it is an ongoing conversation. And the more that leaders can, engage in that conversation, which sounds kind of woo-woo, but
but it's not.
That's the reality that we're in.
It's the reality. And I think in our post-pandemic world, a little woo-woo goes a long way for a lot of people. So
well, on that note, thank you, Olalah, for your time.
Absolutely.
We'll talk again soon.
All right. Thanks for having me. Take care.